Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of the Put a Fork in It podcast, the podcast delivering fresh perspectives at the intersection of food, health, business, and creativity. I'm your host, Kaylina Cahill, photographer, storyteller, and creative entrepreneur. Today's guest, Dr. Nicole Farmer, is a board-certified physician in internal medicine and integrative medicine and a certified holistic health coach. She currently works at the Casey Health Institute in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Her practice is dedicated to a patient-focused clinical approach and to the therapeutic use of whole foods and nutrition for wellness and disease prevention, and includes cooking demonstrations. Nicole and I actually met through the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Naturally, I was intrigued to see that a physician was involved in an association for food professionals, so we met up the last time I was in the DC area. It turns out she has quite an extensive background combining medicine, biology, nutrition, cooking, and overall health. A few specifics. Nicole has her Bachelors of Science in Genetics and Molecular Biology from the University of Maryland at College Park and is a graduate of Howard University College of Medicine. She has fellowship training in integrative medicine from the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine under the direction of Dr. Andrew Weil. She was a fellow in the Duke University Integrative Medicine Leadership Program and was a research fellow at the National Institutes of Health, where she worked on clinical research on the burdens of diabetes and health disease. After graduation, Nicole did her residency training in internal medicine at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia and held a faculty position in the Division of General Internal Medicine at Johns Hopkins University Hospital in Baltimore. And in addition to all that, if she wasn't busy enough, she has authored and contributed to several scientific articles and completed training in nutrition and health coaching through the Institute of Integrative Nutrition. Through this training, she developed and refined her love for cooking and giving demonstrations, leading her to do cooking education at the Culinary Institute of America. So, Nicole, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig in and discuss your background and how you use food and cooking in your practice.
Great, let's start.
All right, so our audience just heard about all of your really impressive credentials and all your education and everything. But tell me, why did you decide to go into medicine in the first place?
Oh, that started many years ago. I decided to go into medicine for the same reasons a lot of physicians go into it. We want to help people, and we naturally have a curiosity that we want to satisfy for science and for learning more. And I've always wanted to be a doctor since the time I was in elementary school. I also usually express an interest in looking at genetics and looking at molecular biology during a lot of my pre-med studies. And that's what led me to really start off my career at NIH as a research fellow before I started medical school, so that I could explore some more research opportunities before deciding that medical school was my absolute career love.
Mm-hmm. Can you dig into that a little bit more? I don't know anything about medical school, and I don't really know a lot about cellular or molecular biology. So what specifically intrigued you in those areas?
Yeah, so I'll have to take you probably back to the 10th grade when I was first introduced to cellular biology by one of my high school teachers. And at that time, in the early 90s, cellular biology was really starting to become a field. And essentially, it is just using technology to look at the operations that go on that make all of our cells function and make our cells grow and make them divide, and looking at the genes that determine when our hair cells decide to grow and when our liver cells decide to divide and when they decide to stop growing. So that's the basis of what cellular biology is. And it uses a lot of biotechnology in order to do that. And biotechnology has to do a lot with merging computer systems, as well as also some basic laboratory techniques. And I hope that that's not too much of an explanation.
No, that was perfect. So what about, obviously it sounds interesting just in general, but what specifically within that topic interested you enough to pursue it? I mean,
what interested me is the wanting to know exactly, we all live in our bodies. We are all just compilations of cells, and we sometimes don't take that for granted, and we don't actually think about all of the intricacies and the mechanics that go into every single second of operation of our body. And for me, it was just being able to move from the outside of my body to further exploring the inside that was just so satisfying, that made me go into cellular biology.
And then you also did genetics, right?
Yes, that's a big component of cellular biology, because the storehouse of all of our cells contain copies of our genes. So when we're looking at how our cells divide and how they grow and stop growing, by just the fact that our copies of our genes are involved or are included in every cell, then genetics naturally becomes a part of cellular biology.
Right, that makes sense. And I mean, I know some basics about each of them, but I'm by no means an expert. I mean, the only biology I took was, basically 10th grade, and I may have taken like intro to biology or something as a gen ed, but, I started reading that book, Gene. I don't remember who wrote it, but it's like within the last year that it came out. It's like the history of genetics as a field, basically.
Oh, I bet that is interesting.
But I started listening to it on Audible, actually. So, but in any case, so let me get this straight. So you did the clinical research after your bachelor's?
Yes, I did that as a pre-doctoral fellow. Yes.
So how did your degree in biology and those deep subjects in biology lead you to researching diabetes and heart disease?
So I had the opportunity at that time to work with a group that was really looking at the cellular biology of diabetes, and the fact that diabetes is really when we're looking at the problem that occurs with diabetes and the losing the ability to control our blood sugar, the problem really is happening within the cells of the pancreas, within the cells of the liver, and within the cells of the muscles in our thighs and our arms. That's where the problem is occurring. What we see clinically and what we see as patients is that we have high blood sugar. But the issue really starts at the cellular level. And I just had the good fortune of having contacts with people within this group that were studying diabetes specifically at that cellular level. And it just was a good fit.
Mm-hmm. So as somebody who has become passionate about health myself, and learning a lot about the problems with sugar lately. And I'm sure that since the time that you were doing that research, there's been a lot more research that's been done.
Oh, yes.
So for those in our audience who don't really know much about diabetes, can you just give in a nutshell what's going on in the body when diabetes is present?
So in diabetes, we lose the ability to control our blood sugar at the level that our body naturally needs to keep it. Whenever we eat sugary foods, or if we eat starchy foods like rice, after we eat the food is digested in the stomach, and then the carbohydrates are absorbed into our bloodstream. That carbohydrate or that sugar has to then be taken into our liver cells and into our muscle cells so that we can actually use it for energy. And that's what insulin allows us to do. Insulin is the hormone that we become deficient in, or it stops working well in diabetes.
So in your description of what diabetes is, you mentioned rice and starchy foods. We all pretty much expect sugary foods like cookies and cakes to not be good for us, and it's not really too surprising. But things like rice and potatoes, we tend to think of those as being healthy for us. So can you talk a little bit about that distinction or what's going on there, or maybe potatoes aren't actually good for us?
Right. So thanks for that question. So there is a bit of a distinction to make when we're talking about sugars. This is what I explain to patients. When you're dealing with just plain white sugar, you're talking about your blood sugar level goes from 0 to 60 in a matter of a couple of seconds. Whereas if we're looking at other carbohydrate or other starchy foods, such as brown rice, then it's going to go from 0 to 60 in over a minute. So it's going to take a much longer time period for the blood sugar to actually peak, and therefore it gives more time for insulin to actually function. And because we don't have such a rapid peak, the body doesn't have to push out so much insulin to actually lower the blood sugar level. With white rice and with white bread, they are a bit better than just plain white sugar, but they still raise your blood sugar level pretty quickly, and much more quickly than if you're eating brown rice or if you're eating whole grain bread.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so what about, like, I see in all these like healthy baking websites or whatever, where they substitute things like coconut sugar or maple syrup or honey for sugar, and they claim it's healthy and that it's better. Is there any truth to that, or is it like sugar is sugar is sugar?
No, there is some truth to that. So if you look at coconut sugar is, as I prefer to call it, a sweetener, because it actually contains a lot of the whole form of coconut. So you're going to have some of the fibrous material that we normally have in coconut. You also have the minerals and the nutrients still retained within the coconut sugar. And those things will actually slow down the process of raising the blood sugar from 0 to 60. And those minerals are going to actually help the insulin hormone that the pancreas has to create. The minerals will help the insulin to function better. So it is better to use sweeteners like a coconut sugar than just plain white sugar. You also mentioned honey. Honey is another sweetener that has a mineral that contains minerals, and there are different variations of honey. But if we just take the basic honey that most people use, the honey contains a lot of minerals. It also contains fructose, which is a different type of sugar than if we're just using sucrose or just using glucose sugar. So yes, these are better alternatives than just white sugar in baking.
Mm-hmm. And so with coconut sugar, I mean, it is processed and broken down it's not like you're throwing a whole coconut into your recipe. So does that processing and breaking down of the sugar remove important nutrients? I mean, you were saying that some of it's maintained, but like
some of it is maintained. Yes.
Is it a significant enough portion where it's worth it? Basically?
So I actually don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
That's
fine. Do know a significant amount of potassium is maintained in most of the coconut sugars, just because I've looked that up for patients in the past. But I definitely would prefer patients use coconut sugar over white sugar.
And how about something like stevia?
So with stevia is not actually a sugar. It's a sweet tasting plant material. The stevia that is marketed and commercialized now, that's Truvia, that is a processed version of stevia, and it actually tastes different than if you grow a stevia plant yourself and let the leaves dry and taste it for yourself. It tastes completely different. And there are some commercialized brands of that contain stevia that also add in added sugars like maltodextrin to add a sweeter taste and to make it taste a lot more like sugar. It is a better alternative than white sugar, but you do have to look at the brand that you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
and read the ingredients. I ask patients to read the ingredients. The liquid stevias that you see in the markets, those are most reliably going to be just stevia and not have any added sugars.
Okay. And you mentioned maltodextrin, and having done a little bit of research on sugar, I know that companies that produce sweet foods often use a multitude of different types of sugars into varying degrees of processing, and they call them by all sorts of different names. There was obviously some deception going on and also some cost things going on probably. But can you talk a little bit about the differences between some of these sugars, or if there is even a recognizable difference, like nutrition wise and like effect on the body wise, like between things like high fructose corn syrup, regular corn syrup, fructose by itself, maltodextrin, dextrose, inverse cane, whatever, like all these different things. Like,
right. All of the various type of sugars. You mentioned high fructose corn syrup, and I'll start with that one. That sweetener, the effect of that sweetener on the body is very much like the expectation that we have for fructose, and that fructose will not raise our blood sugars from 0 to 60 very quickly. Fructose actually was usually recommended as an alternative sweetener for diabetics for that reason. However, we know that fructose does change the way the liver actually handles taking glucose into its cells. And so because of that, what happens is that insulin stops working as well on our liver cells when we eat a lot of fructose. The problem with high fructose corn syrup is that because it is a very cheap commercial product that is added to a lot of foods, we see an increased amount of intake of high fructose corn syrup unknowingly by a lot of Americans. And that's the problem that we as clinicians have with high fructose corn syrup, is that because of the overabundant amount that we're consuming because we eat too many processed food products, then we are actually creating what we call an insulin resistant state in our liver. And what that adds to are clinical problems like fatty liver and high fats or high triglyceride levels. And a lot of people are familiar with high triglyceride levels from when they get their cholesterol reports back from their doctors.
Do you know why that is? I mean, I know that that the liver is involved in converting sugars to fats, but can you go into that a little bit? Because I don't really know the details.
So it has to do with that process of the liver's job of converting sugars. So the liver converts sugars, and when there's to energy, but when there's an excess amount, then it naturally converts them into fats. And when the liver has exceeded its amount of holding fat within its own cells, then it starts to produce increased fats into the blood system, and that's how we get the elevated triglycerides.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we've just used the word fat a lot, and talking about actual fats within the body and cellular fats and all that. But having learned a little bit about nutrition myself in order to lose weight and things like that, I know about the concept of macronutrients and fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So can you talk about the nutrient fat and how it's why it's important and how it's different from, say, the fats in our body? Because it gets, I think it gets conflated a lot. People hear the word fat and they think, oh, I shouldn't eat fat. I should eat fat-free because it's going to make me fat if I eat fat. But I've learned that to be not the case.
Right. So 20 or 30 years ago, that was the nutritionist line was, we should avoid fats and avoid fats. And what we were actually doing is we were promoting people to eat more high carbohydrate foods, excuse me, and more processed foods. But essentially, to answer your question with regard to fats, fats they get a bad reputation unnecessarily. Of the three macronutrients, the protein, carbohydrates, and fats do have the highest amount of calories. So for 1 gram of fat, it's 9 calories. But fats also do supply a lot of nutrients to the cells, especially to the layers of the cells. All of our cells have an outline, a membrane layer that helps each cell communicate best with its neighbor and with other cells in the body. And fats are essential for helping to create that membrane layer. The healthier the fats are that you eat, the healthier that membrane layer for all of your cells will be. And we know over the last 10 years that there are different types of fats. Trans fats, a lot of people have now been educated about and are mostly removed from a lot of restaurants and from a lot of processed foods because those trans fats were actually creating toxic fats in our membrane layer, in our cellular membrane layers. And there are lots of good fats that, yes, are calorically rich, but you don't need to have a large serving in order for them to satisfy you in your foods, in order for them to provide flavor, but also in order for them to provide health for our cells.
Can you give it a couple examples of those?
Sure. Well, I think one is olive oil. Olive oil is what we call a monounsaturated fat. So that means that all of the fat molecules are nice and tightly linked together, and that makes them pretty stable and wonderful to add to a cellular membrane layer. Olive oil also contains antioxidants and nutrients. And so I think olive oil is a great example of a fat that actually provides more to us than just what we naturally think of as a fat, as just satisfying flavor.
You just mentioned the word polyunsaturated fat, right? That's the one you just said?
Oh, I said monounsaturated.
Monounsaturated. Okay, so the other one is the
polyunsaturated.
So what is that?
So polyunsaturated are fats that don't have as much of a tight bond together, and therefore it's much easier for things like air and for heat to actually come in and disrupt those bonds and turn those fats into potentially unhealthy fats. And examples of a widely used polyunsaturated fat are corn oil or vegetable oils. And let me say that not all fats are exclusively one poly or monounsaturated. Nature doesn't work that way. Olive oil is mostly monounsaturated. The polyunsaturated fats are mostly polyunsaturated, but all of the fats have a bit of a mix of each other in them.
Okay, and then so that's unsaturated. How about saturated fats? We hear about saturated fats in things like red meat and things like that, and there's a lot of talk out there about whether they're good or bad and their effect on cholesterol and things like that. So let's get to basics.
Let's get to the basics. So the saturated fats, I think they have also gotten a bad reputation. In terms of causing elevation in cholesterol. There have been more recent studies in the clinical literature and even in the clinical cardiology literature looking at not all saturated fats are the same, and that when you actually look at the diet that surrounds the saturated fat, we may actually be able to still have a healthy diet as long as it contains not a large amount of saturated fat. And large amount for everyone is different, but we're talking about usually 30% for total fat.
So what are some examples of saturated fats?
Plant-based ones are coconut oil is an example of a saturated fat from plants. Obviously, animal products would be butter, as you mentioned, red meat.
Okay. How about avocado? What kind of fat is avocado?
That is actually like an olive oil, and it is mostly monounsaturated. It does have some saturated fat, but it also has a little bit more monounsaturated.
Okay.
So avocado is a great fat to include in the diet.
How much avocado should a person eat in a serving? I mean, obviously that's going to range based on your body and
Yeah, based
things
on
like that.
right.
But I mean, like, should you eat like half an avocado or like 3 avocados? Or I mean, like, what's a serving?
I think 3 is way too much. I think in the right seasonal temperature, most people can eat 1 avocado a day.
Okay. All right. 1 avocado a day. Sounds
Yeah.
good. All right. So when you're talking about sugar and its effect within the body, and especially the fructose and how the liver can turn it into fats, and then how the body's actually breaking fats down. Well, you didn't actually talk about that, but within like digestion, I mean, the whole point of the fat is what? So that it can be broken down into energy, right?
Yes.
So it sounds like it's kind of like the reverse. So like fat will be converted into energy and carbohydrates will be converted into fat to some degree. Is that true?
So carbohydrates are not broken into fat. Fat can be changed into carbohydrates.
Okay.
Fat and protein the body has the ability to change fats and proteins into carbohydrates.
Okay.
It's just that the processes that do that require a lot of energy, and so they're not the default or the first ones chosen by the body.
Okay. So within your practice, what's the biggest like nutrition related problem that you're seeing?
The biggest I see is pre-diabetes. So pre-diabetes is the condition that was just kind of reclassified a few years ago as actually being a health condition that we need to be aware of. It is when it's the period of years before the body actually develops diabetes that we can start to see that the ability to create insulin or the ability of your insulin to work well is starting to slow down. So your blood sugar may not be all the way at the 0 to 60 range, may not be all the way at the 60 range right away, but it may stay at around 40 to 50 and just be a little bit too high for a longer period of time. And we can best test that for prediabetes by doing a lab test called hemoglobin A1C. And that test allows us to look at a 3-month range of what your blood sugar has been.
Okay. And so pre-diabetes, there's not any actual symptoms. It's just a period of time when your blood sugar seems too high and there's...
Yes.
Okay.
But it has associated factors that we see with it. So oftentimes we see elevated cholesterol with it, or we see an elevated waistline, or also mildly high blood pressure readings in the clinic. And so altogether, all of those factors form a syndrome called Metabolic Syndrome that essentially are all linked by the inability of the body to control or regulate our blood sugar.
Okay. And what seem to be the causes of this?
The two biggest causes I see are inactivity of people and eating packaged or processed foods.
Okay. Inactivity seems like it's fairly obvious, but maybe not. But eating packaged foods, let's talk into that one a little bit. Why is eating packaged foods so bad?
So if we go back to the high fructose corn syrup, issue. Um, a lot of packaged foods contain high fructose corn syrup. Um, a few years ago, I actually did this with my husband, and we just went through the market and just looked at the number of foods that had high fructose corn syrup in it as ingredients, and it was amazing, like foods that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Definitely ketchup. We found a couple mustards, some relish, yogurts,
Yeah, the one that shocked me,
sauces.
the one that shocked me the most was salad dressings.
Yes, salad dressings, pickles. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, no, I totally know all about that because I recently did a project. I think I mentioned it to you in an email, but it's not public yet, like out on in the world, so people listening might not know. But I worked on this project with a food stylist, and I basically we made photos about this whole topic of sugar and hidden sugars within foods, and I went through and I tried to pick foods that were kind of surprising about how much sugar they had in them, but that people might have otherwise thought of as healthy.
Hmm.
And so I did like a day's worth of meals. And we did 2 shots for each meal: breakfast, lunch, afternoon snack, dinner, and evening, like piece of chocolate, whatever thing.
Hmm.
So each meal had 2 pictures, and the one picture was like a beautiful picture of the meal, and then the other picture was some kind of like mirror image of the picture, the initial one, but showing the quantity of sugar.
Wow. That.
And then we also did some more like conceptual ones that were about specific statistics related to diabetes and deaths and heart disease and the different diseases that can come as a result of too much sugar and things like that. So yeah, I also was shocked when I saw the amount of foods with high fructose, not even just high fructose corn syrup, but like once you start looking into it, and like I mentioned before, all these different names that there's a little bit of deception going on with. So
Yeah, deception. I think that's the biggest thing. And the biggest problem with packaged foods is that you don't know what you're getting. Um, we tend to read only the front label, like we see, oh, healthy salad dressing or low fat salad dressing, or light salad dressing, and we just pick it up and we take it and we add it into our diet. And we're expecting this food to feed our body and to nourish our body and to help our cells function, but we're deceived because we're actually adding in ingredients that are going to work against us. And so that's the biggest thing with packaged food is the deception.
yeah, I think you just made a key point without realizing it, but the what you just said about feeding our cells to help them function, like I think that as a culture, there's some really exciting things going on in food, and every culture has its own different style of food and way of preparing and things like that, and it's really great. And there's all this other stuff with food too, like the joy of company and all of that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
that we get so like distracted from the fact that actually food is like on a core level meant to provide us energy to make our body function.
Yes, it is.
And so we forget that. And then we find ourselves, out in the world going, I'm hungry. But like, is that a real hunger or is that like not a real hunger?
Right.
And we've gotten so far from like, I mean, unless you've like paid a lot of attention and like learned to listen to your body signals, or like you have control over it in terms of like if you're using some sort of like MyFitnessPal and like tracking your food and have
Hmm.
specific like systems to deal with it, but like most people probably don't. And
No.
so yeah, it's
But so one thing I find is that it's very easy to have, it's hard to start this conversation with patients, but once they get it and once you say to them that food is here to serve your body, it's like a light bulb goes on, and then they they get it. And it becomes a lot easier to control their diabetes and their prediabetes because they absolutely get that point that we're supposed to be using food for improving our function and not just for flavor. Flavor is wonderful. I love to cook. We all need it, but it's about more than that. It's a hard conversation to start, but it's such an important one, and people absolutely do get it.
So how do you have that conversation with people?
That's the problem. If we're talking about the clinical setting, a lot of doctors don't feel versed enough to start the conversation or feel comfortable enough to guide patients through the completion of the conversation. So they'll just tell patients, oh, you should eat a better diet. But it's actually more than that to start the conversation and to help someone change how they choose food. You start by asking them. I ask everyone, what are the foods that they love to eat? And what are the foods that they want to keep in their life? And what are the foods that they want to change in their life? And usually everyone has something that they want to keep in terms of their food or add. And that usually becomes the starting point for how we talk about food. As I make it very much about them and not about me wanting to be their doctor and change something immediately in their diet.
Mm-hmm. I heard a few key things in that, which was not changing everything immediately all at once. And then also keeping things,
Yes.
and making it about their actual preferences. I mean, that's key. I know, like, when I was growing up, I was overweight. And I can't tell you how many times I went to the doctor and they're like, your BMI and this and that, and you need to eat healthier and stop with the sweets. Like, that didn't do anything for me.
Right. It makes you feel bad about yourself, and you don't want to work with that person who made you feel bad about yourself.
Right. I mean, it wasn't helpful at all. I mean, and you could tell people all day long they need to eat more fruits and vegetables. Everybody like knows that on some level, but it's not very practical. It's not.
No, it's not. So I tend to start people out. You may have heard like the saying 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Excuse me. I tend to start people out by just asking them to just increase by 1. Whatever they're doing in terms of a vegetable, I just want them to increase by 1 serving. And the goal is to get people to 2.5 cups of vegetables, of cooked vegetables a day. I don't include fruit in that total.
What about raw salad?
Yes. So raw salad is an extra. That is a bonus.
Okay.
But what I find is that when people tell me that I eat vegetables and I eat a salad, then when I actually deconstruct the salad with them, when we recount what they put on the salad, it's a lot of protein, a lot of cheese, a lot of dressing that they did not make. That was actually a packaged dressing, and a lot of extra things in addition to the lettuce at the bottom of the bowl.
Okay. That makes sense. So what about when you ask them, okay, what in your diet do you want to keep? And all they can think of is like, white bread and cookies and ice cream.
Then they can keep it, but we just have to set limits on how much we eat of it. And then I ask them the hunger question about when you eat it. Are you really hungry? What are you feeling? What are you thinking? What was your motivation for it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's.
But I don't ask them to remove it right away from their diet.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think in my own experience, that's a really important thing that, like, in the end, it's about balance. Finding the right balance for you, and were you actually hungry, or was it to cure boredom, or to feel a little bit of a dopamine rush because you were sad, or something like that. But I found like certain
right.
foods,
exactly, which is okay.
Yeah, just as long as you don't get into a bad emotional eating cycle.
Right.
But
right, so I have privilege of working with a wonderful therapist in my current practice, and we refer a lot of patients back and forth to each other. She has the same type of interview style as I do in terms of food questions, and we find that we're uncovering anxiety and depression a lot when we just ask people, well, why are you eating the ice cream every day? What's the feeling that led you there? And you do realize that people are looking for that serotonin and that dopamine rush. And then they start talking to you about their feelings and about their anxiety and their depression. So you're starting to like get to the root cause that leads to the ice cream every day. So I mean, I just think food is a wonderful way to actually explore what's going on with people and learn more about them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wanted to add one more thing about the bad foods.
Hmm.
I've found like once I started learning about actual like nutrients within foods and the caloric content of different foods, and exploring, like uh, when I'm feeling hungry and if I decide to say eat like a little pastry or something, I've realized that actually I don't feel full enough from it. And so that's part of causing me to overeat because it ends up being so
Yes.
calorie dense but nutrient poor
Yeah.
that I'm not actually full after eating it, so I need to keep eating. And so then I've just added an extra 200 calories to my day for no reason.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't even that satisfying.
Right. 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 And so I am completely with you. Once you get used to your body feeling fulfilled from food and that nutritious type of feeling, excuse me, it actually makes it very hard to go back to the empty calorie diet.
Right. Yeah. Totally. Because there's been times where I've just been like, okay, it's like 11 at night. I'm hungry. I've gotten to the point where I recognize like it's a legitimate hunger. And I know that I've had, like, I'm in the right range of calories. So it's okay if I eat, but like, I won't be overeating if I eat some more.
Right.
But then I'm like, okay, what can I eat that's like, 100 calories, but it's going to actually make me feel full.
Yes.
and and so then I'm say at home and there's all these pastries around because I'm living, with people that like that stuff, and they're like, oh well, why don't you have this like apple turnover? And I'm just like, ugh, I'm not gonna feel full after it, and it's gonna be like 300 extra calories and
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. It will not be worth it.
yeah. So anyway, um, all right. So we're talking a little bit about referring patients back to the therapist that you work with in your practice and uncovering emotional problems with food and things like that.
Yes.
So actually, that's a good point to talk about. So having grown up overweight and lost a lot of weight after learning about all this stuff, I've been able to, in myself, recognize when I'm getting into a bad pattern or a bad cycle with emotional eating, or like be able to stop myself before, say, eating the ice cream, or
Mhm.
at least delay it, put off. And then, half the times if I put it off, then I don't ever go back to eating it because I like get distracted by something else.
Mhm.
But I found with the prevalence of overweight and obesity in our country, there's a lot of people. There's like this whole like body positive movement, or people that are like, oh, it's okay to be fat and blah blah blah, and that a lot of people they end up blaming. They say, oh well, it's something. It's they don't like admit to themselves what's really going on, and they blame it on some other pre-existing health condition, and I'm sure that some of them are legitimately other health concerns, but what are you seeing out, like what do you see as maybe like some of the primary causes of this problem?
I think going back to the issue with diabetes and prediabetes, it is we have an inactivity in the packaged food, which I think are symptoms of the convenience type of society that we live in, where everything is very convenient for us. We don't have to walk to the store to get a loaf of bread anymore. We don't have to make our own foods. We can have everything delivered to us, and we just use our app to get it. And so, because of the convenience factor, we really do kind of become lazy about taking care of ourselves. And I think that that's a big issue with it. But I do think there are a couple of other things. Um, I find a lot of patients talk to me about emotional eating, and these patients aren't necessarily overweight. Some of them are very thin too. But even within the thin ones, because they're emotionally eating a lot of sugar, they are still pre-diabetic. They still have high cholesterol. Um, they're what we call the skinny fat patients, and we have to address their issues too. So emotional eating, I think, is one of the most undiagnosed problems we have in my clinical setting. Is actually talking to patients about why they're engaging in this type of eating pattern, why they're choosing these foods, what are their relationships like in their lives, what do they do for fun, what brings them joy. These are all kind of getting underneath the skin questions that allow us to uncover things that oftentimes we don't have time to do in a 15-minute visit, unfortunately. But I think that all of those combined are contributing to the obesity problem.
Okay. Um, so what types of people come into your practice that you're seeing that emotional eating
That are
is?
emotional eaters.
Yeah, I mean, what types of people, like in terms of demographics and socioeconomics, are coming into your practice that you're seeing that emotional eating is a big problem?
Oh, we span all different types of socio-demographic groups. So I see this in our Medicaid patients, our Medicare patients, our very, excuse me, our very professional um, socioeconomic patients. I hear the same story in different patients, different ethnicities, different sizes. Um, so I don't think that it is just one particular socioeconomic
Hmm.
class that is subject to this.
So why do you think it's so pervasive?
I think it's a matter of our society as a whole. And not that I'm trying to be a pessimist, but I do think that it's more of a symptom of us in general not being connected to each other, not being connected to what really fulfills us in ourselves. I also live in a region that is very fast paced and um, very urban and high achievers. So it's very much like trying to do, and not a lot of time in terms of pausing. And so I think that that may have something to do too with the patients that I've seen because of just where I am. It's a high cost of living. People, if they have a high profession, they have a very demanding job. If they're not professional, they have multiple jobs due to the cost of living and education. So it may just be a manifestation of that, of what I'm seeing in terms of a lot of patients with emotional eating.
Okay. Hmm. How can we fix this? Can we fix this?
So I think we can. So what we did last year in our practice is we started a group visit for all of the pre-diabetes patients, and we modeled the visits off of the diabetes prevention lifestyle study that was done many years ago that showed that if you can improve the way people eat and you can get them to walk 30 minutes a day 4 times a week, that you could prevent diabetes. So we ran 2 different groups every week with about 14 patients in each group, and we just talked about food and we talked about activity and what motivates us or doesn't or what prevents us from engaging in these two things. And what we found over doing this for 6 months is that when people came together and they stated their stories, they heard other people's stories, they started to change what they did. Um, they These are people that have very busy lives that made time to come to these groups to feel this connection and to feel this community with each other. And everyone lost weight. Everyone's A1C numbers improved. It was just amazing to see what the importance of relationships and relationship building can do for how you change your health and how you start to improve those health conditions that people have told you will never change.
Interesting. That's really incredible to hear those results.
Yeah, so I think
Yeah.
that's the way that we change the eating patterns and that we improve people's health, is bringing people together. It sounds very simplistic, but it works.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. People can provide support, but they can also provide inspiration and motivation.
Yes,
It's probably part of why things like Weight Watchers works.
exactly. Exactly.
I know that for myself, when I was going through my whole weight loss process, it was incredibly difficult because I wasn't part of any kind of support group. It was just me against the household situation where, I was
It's very hard.
I was all by myself, like trying to learn about how to cook better and how to eat better and how to understand macronutrients and calories and
Kudos to you. That's a hard job.
it was super hard, and not to mention like finding reliable sources.
Right.
That was incredibly complex. Deciding like, okay, well, what about paleo? What about vegetarians? What about ketogenic? All these buzzwords and all these things, and you're like, okay, but like what? And then you hear about the microbiome, and you're like, what do you mean the little bacteria in my stomach is making me eat more sugar?
Right. It's really controlling my body.
So you mean it's not me? It's not.
Well, they're involved in the process.
All right. Okay. So what does that mean? They're involved in the process. I haven't really done a lot of research on the microbiome and these bacteria, but we're starting to hear a lot more about this in the mainstream.
Yes.
So can you go into a little bit about what that means and what's coming out of the research right now?
So let me say that we don't know everything that our gut bacteria or our microbiome are capable of doing, or every avenue of where they intercede or interject in our biology. But what we do know is that, excuse me, there are a lot of connections between different strains of our gut bacteria. And our gut bacteria are the bacteria that live in our large intestine.
Okay.
And these bacteria are responsible for all different types of processes, such as helping our colon cells to actually be healthy and renewable. They also help our liver in terms of allowing a lot of the liver's detoxification processes to work a lot better. They also are involved with how our body creates serotonin. Most of our serotonin for our body is actually in our gut system, and we need our gut bacteria to actually help provide us with the pre-serotonin products in order to have healthy serotonin. So they're involved in a lot of different parts of our biology, and they are part of every process that we go through. So if you're good to your gut bacteria, you're essentially good to your body. And one of the best ways to be good to your gut bacteria is to eat fiber in your diet, because fiber is food for the gut bacteria.
So that kind of goes into why processed and refined sugars and refined carbs are not so good because
Absolutely.
they take away the fiber.
Yes. Yes, they
Or
take away the fiber. You're going to, if you do not have a fiber in your diet, you're going to create a state of imbalance in your gut bacteria, and you're not going to be as healthy as you want to be.
so what's a simple way to get more fiber in your diet?
You mentioned avocado earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Avocado is a wonderful source of fiber.
Mm-hmm.
I also ask patients to use flaxseed in their diet.
What are some simple ways to use flax seeds?
Sprinkle them on top of your yogurt with berries in the morning. You can sprinkle them over top of your salads. I even put some in water and just let it become like a mucilage type of goo. And then I'll add that to my oatmeal in the morning. But you can also sprinkle flaxseed on oatmeal.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of different recipes for flaxseed.
And how about like flax versus chia?
So flax has more omega-3s. Chias also contain omega-3 fatty acids, but they have more antioxidants. Chia has less fiber than flax. So I tend to push patients towards flax seeds.
Mm-hmm.
But chia seeds are wonderful too. And chia pudding is a great recipe.
So if you're, what about like if you have ground flax, are you still gonna get the same benefits from like a
Oh, I
ground
meant to
flax
state
meal?
that I have everyone grind it
Oh, okay.
every couple of days and keep it in their freezer or refrigerator.
Oh, okay. So it is
Yeah.
actually ground. It's not a
Yes.
whole seed then. I remembered I wanted to ask this before. So what exactly is integrative medicine?
Integrative medicine is combining conventional medicine along with different holistic or complementary or alternative practices in order to make a complete holistic evaluation of how to treat a patient.
So what does that mean? I know the word holistic and the holistic health, particularly that phrase, it gets a lot of like woo woo.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that?
And so holistic can mean, it just basically means the whole person in front of you. But when we're talking about holistic treatments, then you're thinking about treatments that actually try to complement the entire patient. So if I'm just going to take, for example, a Chinese herbal, and I'm not a Chinese herbalist, but if you look at a Chinese herbal formula, the way that an acupuncturist or a Chinese herbalist would actually decide which formula will be best for you is they do a full evaluation of you in terms of what you're eating, what your digestion is like, what your sleep is, what your overall outlook on life is, and then they also evaluate your constitution or what your makeup is. And all of that goes into their selection of an herbal formula for you. That's a holistic view of you before we decide on a treatment. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
in conventional medicine, it is more of we would just wonder, well, what is your symptom, and let your symptom alone determine what the treatment is for you. And so that's the difference between a holistic and a non-holistic approach.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, like especially now that we've been starting to establish how interconnected everything really is. Like
Mm-hmm.
thinking even like about the gut bacteria. I mean, just as a simple example, the gut bacteria, because
Right.
you're like they're involved in basically every process, and you're like, I didn't even know these little things were there.
Right, exactly.
Right. Okay, and then the other part of that you use the word treatment. So I've noticed, in like advertising, like on TV or even like online, so many ads for all these different drugs. Ask your doctor about this drug. Is this drug right for you? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and there's such a focus. They call it healthcare, but yeah, it's not really. It's more like sick care. So, I mean, I don't know. It's not really a question. It's more of an observation.
Yeah,
But
no, I mean, I observe the same thing. Believe me, I use pharmaceuticals and I use prescription medication because they're great tools, but we have to use them appropriately, and we have to also think about, well, what are some non-drug tools that I can use to get the same result in this person before I reach for my prescription pad. And the direct-to-consumer type of marketing that's occurring with the pharmaceutical companies, it actually does interrupt the doctor's ability to try to think of something else, because the patient is already coming to you with what they think the solution is and presenting you with the expectation that you'll provide it to them. So yeah, those commercials do not help us at all.
So, how would you determine if it's right to use, say, a pharmaceutical versus like, you know, eliminating sugar or something?
So the question I ask myself is, how am I going to best serve the patient for what they're presenting to me? So I had a patient not too long ago who has prediabetes, advanced prediabetes. And in the conventional medicine world, it is perfectly acceptable to start her on metformin, which is a diabetes medication, to help to lower her blood sugar, even though she's just in the prediabetes realm. Well, this is an elderly woman who doesn't get to be very mobile, who has a very hard time controlling her diet herself because of her current economic and social situation. So if I were to best serve her, I can't go in there and say, well, we're going to cut the sugars out and you're going to walk 30 minutes 3 times or 4 times a week. I have to think about, how am I going to best serve her? So I did prescribe her metformin at a low dose, and I did start having her talk to the nutritionist, but I know that it's going to be a very longer conversation to get things to change for her, and I don't want her blood sugars to increase while we're waiting for the change to happen. So that's kind of how I weigh things out in my head when I make these decisions.
Yeah, that's really an important distinction. I mean, because that really goes to the holistic sense too. You know,
Right.
because if you're just like, okay, you know, you have two people behind a two different people behind a black screen, and they both have the same stats. You know, if you're just looking at the stats, well then, like, obviously, I mean, to me, obviously, you would say, okay, well, reduce your sugars and walk more, because, like, why spend money on drugs if you don't have to?
Right. Right.
and introduce a foreign substance to the body when you don't have to.
Right.
But, you know, that's not paying any attention to any of the other factors.
Right. Exactly. So you have to look at all of the factors that are at play with that patient.
But is there, like, would you say that you're unique in that approach, or is that a common practice? Like, do other doctors tend to jump to prescribing, or do they?
So I don't want to say that all doctors tend to jump to prescribing medications. I do think that oftentimes we overuse them, but I just want to give doctors a break. And
Right.
there's a lot of times where you have such a small narrow of time with the patient that you go for the quickest path that's going to lead to a resolution of the visit. And oftentimes that is a medication, because you don't have time to engage in the conversation about lifestyle or about what matters to the patient or all of these other things. So yes, we overuse it, but I do think it's the intention of most doctors to want to do more. It's just, in the medical education system, I don't think we do a good job with providing doctors with the ability to do more and the tools to do more.
How so?
Well, we don't do a lot of nutrition education in medical school or in residency. That's changing in the last couple of years, but historically that has not been a major part of our education. And then there's definitely not a lot of education about how do you talk to a patient. It was through the Dr. Weil program that I learned about motivational interviewing and the importance of starting hard conversations with patients, but starting it in a way that's focused on what the patient needs and how to serve the patient. And that's not something that we necessarily learn in medical school. We learn how to go in and create a differential diagnosis list in our head while the patient is talking. And we learn how to try to figure out what orders we want to put in to the computer or write down and what scripts we want to order while the patient is talking. It's not about how do we become completely enveloped in that patient's story in order to help them.
Yeah, that sounds like a problem to me.
It's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's a big problem.
So, because I mean, I see like from all the different credentials that I listed in the intro with regards to your background, like you personally, I mean, as somebody that clearly both cares about your patients and people, but also is obviously a high achiever and like wants to improve yourself, like, and your abilities to serve patients, like you went out and sought, you went to find all these different programs, like yourself.
Yeah, so I don't know how much time we have, but I sought these out similar to you, I had a personal health problem that the medical system could not resolve for me, and I had to resolve it myself. And because I had to figure it out myself outside of the doctor's office, then I said to my husband, I said, well, I can't in good conscience go back to just treating patients with a script and treating them, in the way that I have, because I know there's more. So I have to actually take what I found to help us and actually learn how to incorporate it into what I do for my patients. And so that's how I started exploring the Dr. Weil program. And I actually started with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition was my first introduction into health coaching, because I just had my own personal need. And I find as I meet more doctors in integrative and functional medicine, a lot of us actually started on this career path because of personal reasons where we were failed by the system that trained us, which the irony of that is just unspeakable.
I know, right? It's like crazy. Did you face much resistance within the medical community with regards to like going in that direction?
I actually I had some initially of colleagues telling me they didn't know why I was doing this, why I was spending energy into exploring this field. But I was also at a good point in my life where I was at Hopkins, and Hopkins is a wonderful place where it's a complete brain trust. And I was really introduced to people that took integrative medicine seriously there. And so for me, because I was at Hopkins and I'm talking to people that understand why this is important to health, then it allowed me to give credibility to this field when I heard from other people that I shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, because it's like I was saying before, like the idea of like holistic. I mean, that word, it gets so much of a bad rap. Like,
Right, it does.
Like it just, everybody kind of is like, oh, it's woo woo, like there's nothing behind it. But like once you kind of start to dig in, you're like, oh, actually, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It makes
There's a lot to
as a
it.
concept, yeah. Okay, so we've hit a lot of topics, and I'm sure there's a lot more that we could discuss, but we're getting close to time on this, so I have a couple of final questions that I like to ask everybody.
Okay.
And so the first one is, how do you define health or healthy?
Whatever makes you feel genuinely good. That's how I defined healthy.
So what does that mean, genuinely good?
So I add the genuine in because a lot of times we have this false sense of a good feeling, like it's very superficial and you feel good for a second and then it kind of like the crash, like the sugar crash. But a genuine good feeling is one in which you just feel like you are kind of like floating, but you're in your real self and you're smiling and you don't even know why you're smiling. And people tell you that your eyes look happy, and you just genuinely feel good. That is, to me, a state of health.
Okay. And why is that important?
Oh, that's important because when you have that genuine health, then all your cells are functioning right. Your gut bacteria are happy. Your serotonin level is where it should be.
Mm-hmm.
That's just kind of where your body is meant to function. And not that I want to get very kind of outside of the body or into the universe type of conversation, but I think that that's when you're also most resonating with how you're supposed to be and what your purpose is, and that you can't kind of live your purpose if you are not in a healthy state, if you're not genuinely feeling good about yourself or within your skin.
I totally agree with that. But yeah, in any case, so what do you see as the biggest issue facing our society as it relates to food and health?
Lack of cooking at home.
Okay.
More people need to cook their own meals and cook with loved ones at home. I think I think that could help a lot of problems.
All right. And what is the most exciting thing going on in food and health?
I think the most exciting is the interest level that people have in food, and the interest level that people have in learning where their food is coming from. We have a CSA at our practice, and we just have the attention that our patients and people in the community give to the farmer at the CSA, and asking questions and kind of inquiring about why this is in this week's pick versus last week. I mean, I just think that that's so energizing and it's wonderful and it's bringing people connected to themselves and connected to nature. So to me, I think that's one of the best things that's happening.
Before we wrap up, for anybody that's listening to this that before listening to this didn't really know too much and about health or hadn't really been inspired to take action, what are some simple resources that they can look to get reliable information and basics?
About taking the first steps towards their health.
Yes.
So even though I did his fellowship, Dr. And I'm not trying to say this just because I did his fellowship, but I think Dr. Andrew Weil's weekly newsletter is probably one of the best healthy living newsletters around. It every week very simply just states kind of what you can do for movement, what you can do for food, what you can do for mind-body connection, and everything is laid out with wonderful explanations. And he is one of the highest regarded physicians with regard to natural health and integrative medicine. So he's an extremely credible, reliable source. So I would recommend that people go to his website.
Okay, we can link to it. I'll link to it in the post for this. Any others that you might recommend? Like one or two things.
And then also livestrong.org is another wonderful website.
Yeah, that one, Livestrong, is one of the ones that I went to in my process. It was one of the
Yes.
ones that I decided I thought I could trust. I thought,
They do a wonderful vetting of all of their articles. And then this is one person's newsletter too, but I think that he is very credible and he does great explanations. Dr. Axe, AXE.
oh, I haven't heard of him yet.
He has a lot of great tips about changing your diet. He does a lot of explanation about the science behind why it's so important to eat well, a lot of consumer activism in some of his articles. So I like his website also.
Okay. All right, cool. So, awesome. Is there anything else you would like to add that we didn't cover or, pressing with you?
Not that I can think of. No, nothing.
All right. All right. And if anyone listening to this wanted to get in touch with you to learn more or, hear about your practice or, maybe they live in the Maryland area and they're looking for a new doctor.
Yes.
How can they get in touch with you?
I'm at KC Health Institute in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And the website is kchealth.org.
Okay, great. So that's going to be a wrap for us. Thanks again to Dr. Nicole Farmer. It was really great to chat with you and hear more about how you're making an impact in the medical field and with individuals' health and all of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Kalina. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're definitely in alignment, I think, with our views on things, and
definitely
it's great to find somebody in the type of position that you're in that has that viewpoint.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this podcast series.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a lot of fun so far. I mean,
Great.
We're still in the beginning, but I'm figuring it out as I go. So yeah. And I'm sure that everybody listening will get a lot from hearing about your experiences and the wealth of knowledge that you've provided in this interview with regards to the basics of nutrition and the latest research in gut bacteria and diabetes and all these topics that are really complex. And I hope that they can find some tangible information and inspiration to pursue a healthy lifestyle. Thanks again to the listeners for tuning in to this episode of the Put a Fork in It podcast, the podcast delivering fresh perspectives at the intersection of food, health, business, and creativity. We look forward to sharing future episodes and interviewing more interesting people. If you have any feedback or suggestions on what you'd like to hear on this show, or you would be interested in becoming a sponsor, you can email me at kaylina@putaforkinitpodcast.com. And don't forget to check out the episode notes, links, and leave comments over at putaforkinitpodcast.com and to subscribe using your favorite podcasting app. If you love this show and want to support it, you can also share it with a friend or donate on patreon.com/putaforkinit. And of course, make it a delicious day.